before the palace's marble floors and the king's gilded chambers, she was simply a girl named Ariadne. Born in a humble village tucked between the golden hills and misty rivers, Ariadne had never known grandeur. Her life had been shaped by simplicity. Her family, a small yet tight-knit community of weavers and farmers, led a life of quiet traditions. Yet there was something about Ariadne that had always set her apart. Even as a child, she moved differently from others, her body swaying in rhythm with the wind, her feet tracing patterns in the dust, as though the earth beneath her responded to every beat of her soul. Her mother often caught glimpses of her dancing in the fields, at first with playful innocence, but soon with a kind of purpose that seemed out of place in their rural world. It was an ancestral gift passed down through generations, a talent that Ariadne didn't fully understand but felt deep in her bones. The dance, like an echo of the past, was a sacred art in her bloodline. Her grandmother, once a famous dancer, had whispered stories of how their ancestors danced to summon spirits of the land, and how their movements once wove power into the world. Ariadne had been taught the steps, the rhythms, and the sacred dances from an early age, but she always felt as if there was more to it than just the graceful movements. The villagers noticed her gift early on. When she danced, it was more than a performance. It was as if the air itself was charged with energy. Sometimes, her dance would summon gentle winds or cause the earth to tremble ever so slightly, but it was subtle, nothing that anyone could name or comprehend. Her family, proud but cautious, kept her abilities hidden from the outside world, afraid of what others might think or the trouble it might bring. However, the king's emissary arrived one fateful afternoon, riding in from the capital with a group of royal soldiers. Ariadne's village was not one known for its wealth or influence, but every year the king's scouts came to find something extraordinary. The king had grown obsessed with unique talents, believing that any gift, any spectacle, could be his to control. His court was filled with dancers, musicians, and performers of all kinds, but his insatiable desire for novelty led him to search far and wide for someone who could offer him something different, something no one else had. Ariadne's village had heard rumors of the king's obsession with extraordinary talents, but no one dared imagine that they might catch his attention. That is, until the emissary arrived, seeking out the *** dancer with the fire in her feet ***. It was a simple message, carried with the arrogance and entitlement of the king's court. The emissary had heard whispers of a young woman whose dancing held the power to stir the earth and the wind. To them, it was a curiosity, an unknown force that the king would surely want for his own. At first, Ariadne's family refused. They had always kept their daughter close, fearing the dangers of the outside world. But the emissary was persistent, offering riches, land, and safety in exchange for her talent. The offer was tempting, but Ariadne's heart rebelled. Her life was simple, filled with the warmth of the village, the laughter of her family, and the freedom to dance however and wherever she pleased. The idea of being a captive performer, of giving up her autonomy for the king's pleasure, was unbearable. But circumstances changed when a tragedy struck her family. A fire, started by a group of bandits, ravaged their home. With her family left destitute and the village devastated, Ariadne was faced with a choice: stay and watch everything she knew slip away, or go with the king's emissary and offer her gift for a price. Her decision, though painful, was made out of necessity. She had seen the power in her dance. She knew that it could be more than just entertainment, it could be a way to rebuild her family's life, to survive. With a heavy heart, she agreed, knowing that once she left, she might never return. When Ariadne arrived at the king's palace, she was immediately struck by the overwhelming luxury and decadence. The grand halls, the lush gardens, and the shimmering tapestries were worlds apart from the simplicity of her village. The king himself, a man of many desires, welcomed her not as a person but as an object to be displayed. He marveled at her beauty, her grace, and most of all, at the allure of her mysterious power. She was to dance for him, whenever he pleased, however he pleased, with no regard for her wishes. She was a tool to entertain, an object to be controlled. But as Ariadne began to dance in the king's court, something began to stir within her, a power she could not ignore. The first time she moved her feet upon the polished floor of the royal court, there was a sudden, intense heat that emanated from her body, something she had never felt before. She was scared, but there was an undeniable connection between her dance and the earth beneath her. The air grew thick with energy, and it was then that she realized her gift was not simply for show. It was tied to something deeper. She had no words for it, but her feet, the fire in her steps, and the power in her dance seemed to belong to something far greater than the king or even her ancestors had ever understood. Ariadne was no longer simply a dancer. She was a force that could shape the world around her. But she didn't understand what that power meant or what it could cost. The court, however, was beginning to see glimpses of it, and the king was watching closely. He had chosen her for her talent, but it was clear that her true gift was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The stage was set, and Ariadne's dance would soon bring more than just the king's pleasure. It would ignite something much, much more powerful. Life in the king's court was not the grand, magnificent spectacle Ariadne had imagined. Beneath the surface of velvet cushions, sparkling chandeliers and golden goblets, the palace was a world of unrelenting cruelty and opulence built on the backs of others. The king's palace, an architectural marvel of towering spires and lush gardens, held secrets that no gilded exterior could hide. From the moment she stepped inside its towering gates, Ariadne realized that she was not a person here, she was a possession. An ornament. A tool for the king's fleeting amusements. The king himself was a figure of insatiable desires, and nothing in the court fascinated him more than her dance. He would sit for hours in his throne, his cold eyes glued to her every movement, a satisfied smile stretched across his face. To him, Ariadne was not a woman with thoughts, emotions, or dreams. She was a performer, a living spectacle to feed his ego, an object of both fascination and domination. The more she danced, the more he demanded. His pleasure was her burden, and she quickly learned that her worth lay not in her humanity, but in the perfection of her dance. Her performances were not subtle or private. The king would gather his courtiers, his guests, and even foreign dignitaries to watch her dance in the palace's grand hall. It was as though she were a puppet, her limbs moved by strings she could not see, all while the king watched in complete silence, lost in the rhythm of her body. She danced to please him, each graceful movement a calculated attempt to show him her worth while also hiding the deep resentment growing inside her. But for all her resentment, there was a darker, more pressing fear. Her survival depended on his attention. If she faltered, if she ever refused, she knew the consequences could be far worse than her current humiliation. The court women, those privileged enough to be in the king's favor, treated her with a mixture of jealousy and disdain. They watched her with eyes that glittered like daggers, whispering behind their fans about her beauty, her talent, and the king's infatuation with her. Some of them, particularly the older women who had once held the king's attention, sneered at her. She was an outsider in their world, a peasant with no title, no position. But there were others, those whose jealousy turned to pity. They whispered among themselves that Ariadne was nothing more than a puppet, forced to dance for a man who cared only for her body and not the person she was. Some of these women tried to reach out to her, offering soft words of comfort in the quiet corners of the court. A glance, a gentle touch, an offer of friendship, but they were always short-lived. In the end, Ariadne couldn't trust anyone. The court was a snake pit. Those who feigned kindness were often the first to turn on you. Those who had been friends in the beginning became silent, afraid of being drawn into the power struggle. And so, Ariadne learned to trust no one but herself, to retreat into the silence of her thoughts when the courtiers passed her by with scornful gazes. At the center of it all, there was always the king. His obsession with her dance began to grow darker and more possessive. It wasn't enough that she was the object of his attention. Now he wanted her soul, her essence. He would watch her endlessly, demanding that she perform not just for his court, but for his own private pleasure. Each time he wanted something different, a new style of dance, a more intimate, passionate performance. The crowds were no longer enough for him. He began to demand that she dance for him alone, in his private chambers, under the guise of having private rehearsals. But even when no one watched, the pressure remained. The expectation of her perfection, the weight of it, was crushing. Despite this, Ariadne learned to dance through it all, using the movements to silence the chaos in her heart. The dance became her refuge, a place where she could escape the king's grasp, even if only for a moment. But she wasn't blind to the fact that her very ability to escape into her dance only further chained her to him. The longer she stayed, the more entangled she became in his world. But even as her body obeyed the king's every whim, something began to stir within her. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a ripple in the floorboards beneath her feet, a whisper of energy that seemed to respond to her movements. During one of her private performances, as she spun and leapt across the cold marble floor, her feet caused a faint tremor. The court didn't notice, but she did. She could feel the temperature rise ever so slightly, like an invisible flame licking the air. A surge of power was growing inside her, something ancient, untapped, and deeply buried. She couldn't understand it. Her body was in control, but the forces she was conjuring were not hers to command. In one of her dances, while the king watched with a greedy grin on his face, her foot struck the ground in a powerful pirouette. The marble beneath her cracked. The flames in the hearth grew higher, casting long shadows against the wall. The king barely noticed, his gaze was so fixed on her form, but Ariadne could feel it. She could feel the pulse of energy beneath her skin, the heat building in her veins. Her feet had done something, they had awakened something. She realized with a strange mix of terror and awe, that her dancing wasn't just an expression of art, it was an expression of power. But at that moment she didn't know what it meant. She couldn't control it. She didn't understand it. It was as though the earth itself was reacting to her, as though it wanted to feed her. Every movement seemed to draw out this force, and while she knew it was dangerous, she couldn't stop. Not yet. The more she danced, the stronger the feeling grew. In the middle of a delicate waltz, a gust of wind swept through the room, though no window was open. Her body was alive with energy, a force both beautiful and terrifying, but Ariadne was too terrified to acknowledge it fully. The king might notice. He might want to control it. And then what would happen to her? As the days passed, Ariadne found herself in a constant state of duality. Her body was becoming more connected to this magic, but it was at odds with her growing need for freedom. Her dance had brought her here, but it was the same dance that was now threatening to break her free. And yet, she was still trapped by the king's control. The energy was building, and with every graceful movement, Ariadne feared she might lose herself to it. The king had turned her into a performer for his pleasure, but perhaps her dance was meant to be more than just an entertainment, perhaps it was the very thing that would set her free. The night began like any other. Ariadne, dressed in the finest silks provided by the king's court, stepped into the private chamber where he awaited her performance. The room was dark except for the flickering lights of torches along the walls, casting long dancing shadows across the polished floors. The king, seated on his ornate throne, demanded that she entertain him as he always did, gracefully, seductively, and without hesitation. Her heart sank as she gazed at him, knowing that the very act of dancing, something once so sacred and personal to her, had now been reduced to little more than a performance for his pleasure. Yet, despite the oppressive air in the room, something within her stirred, a quiet whisper at the edge of her thoughts, a feeling she couldn't quite name but one she had learned to recognize. Her feet moved without her command, and the music began, a haunting melody that echoed deep inside her soul. The first steps were slow and deliberate, just as they always were, but as her movements grew more intense, something began to change. The air around her grew heavy, charged with an energy she could barely comprehend. A strange heat surged through her limbs, a sensation that spread from the soles of her feet to the tips of her fingers. The ground beneath her began to tremble, ever so slightly at first, and then with a growing intensity, as though the very foundation of the palace was reacting to her dance. The king, his eyes fixed on her, barely noticed at first, his mind lost in the thrill of watching her. But Ariadne could feel it. The heat in the room was becoming unbearable, too much for the palace's cool, stone walls to contain. A faint flicker of light appeared in the air around her, tiny flames dancing at the edge of her vision, like sparks igniting from her every movement. She stumbled, feeling the sudden rush of power in her chest. The flames grew brighter, but they did not burn. They flickered and twirled with the rhythm of her body, responding to her every turn, every leap. The floor beneath her cracked with each step, and the flames followed her, tracing the outline of her body like a trail of fire left in her wake. Ariadne's heart raced, her breath coming faster as the power coursed through her veins. What was happening? She had never felt anything like this before. Her dance wasn't just a performance anymore. It was something alive, something untamed. Her thoughts scattered, a mix of panic and awe. She knew deep down that this magic was more than just her gift. It was a force of nature, one that had awakened in her without warning. The flames had not been an accident. They were connected to her, an extension of the power that pulsed within her bones. With every turn, every spin, the magic grew stronger, more intense. The walls of the chamber grew unbearably hot, and the torches lining the room flickered violently. A small flame leapt from the hearth and hovered in the air as if drawn to her. It was no longer just dance. This was magic, raw and unfiltered, and it was becoming dangerous. The king's eyes gleamed. He had been watching her with growing curiosity, but now something deeper stirred in him. The flames, the heat, the energy, it was intoxicating. Ariadne's dance had always been mesmerizing, but now it was otherworldly, and the king felt the intoxicating pull of that power. It wasn't just beauty he saw, it was potential, something that could be controlled, manipulated. Ariadne, however, had no such thoughts. The magic frightened her. The last thing she wanted was to be controlled further, to be a puppet of the king's whims. The destruction she could feel in her bones made her tremble. Was she becoming something else? Was she turning into a monster, a force of destruction she could neither understand nor control? For a moment she faltered, her feet tripping over the rhythm of the dance as she fought to stop herself from summoning more flames. She didn't want this. She didn't want to be the one who brought destruction upon the palace, upon the king himself. But she could feel it inside her, a surge of fire that burned through her limbs. She was terrified that the more she danced, the more it would consume her. The fear of losing control gripped her heart, but the magic responded to her, pulling her deeper into it. As the flames swirled around her, she stumbled and fell to her knees, her breath ragged. The floor beneath her cracked open with a loud snap, and the room filled with a sharp hissing sound as the flames briefly flared higher. For a moment, everything went silent. Ariadne's heart hammered in her chest, her body trembling from the sheer force of the energy coursing through her. But it wasn't silence that followed, it was laughter. The king was on his feet, clapping, his eyes wild with fascination. More. More Ariadne, he cried, his voice dripping with excitement. This is what I've been waiting for, He saw the flames as a spectacle, a new toy to control, a power that would fuel his desires and feed his endless hunger for dominance. He didn't fear her magic, instead he craved it. The dangerous dance that had once been a personal expression for Ariadne was now something for his amusement and control. He did not see the pain in her eyes. He didn't see the fear that gripped her heart. To him, the flames were simply another way to hold her captive, another way to display her as a possession. Ariadne's fear deepened, but so did her understanding of what she had become. The king would use her just as he had used her body. She was no longer just a dancer, she was a weapon, a force that could bring fire to the kingdom. And yet, the more she danced, the more she feared that this power, once her inheritance, would be the very thing that would destroy her. The king's demands had grown unbearable. Once, he had seen her dance as a form of art, something to amuse and entertain him, a momentary pleasure to indulge in before he turned his attention to the next distraction. But as the flames grew within her, so too did his lust for control. It wasn't enough that she danced for him, he wanted more, He wanted the fire, the raw power that poured from her with every step, and he was willing to push her to the very limit to draw it out. Night after night, he demanded increasingly dangerous dances, each one more brutal than the last. The palace was no longer a sanctuary, and her performances had become an agonizing trial of endurance. The king would sit upon his throne, his cold eyes scanning her, looking for the smallest sign of weakness. If she faltered in the slightest, if her foot slipped or her movement wasn't perfect, he would punish her mercilessly. Sometimes it was a verbal assault, others it was a slap across her face, a reminder that she was nothing more than an object for his pleasure. The worst of it, however, came in the form of public humiliation. He would bring in the court, force her to dance until her limbs were raw, and if she stumbled, he would mock her in front of them all. The audience would laugh, and she would be forced to endure the pain of their eyes on her, like hot coals burning into her skin. One such night, the king demanded a dance unlike any other. He called it a trial of fire, where she would dance in the center of the royal hall, her feet moving across a ring of torches, the flames licking at her ankles as she performed. It was meant to be a spectacle, a performance that would test her limits. The king expected her to obey without question, to show him how far she could push herself before breaking. Ariadne could feel the heat rising within her, but this time it was different. The fire wasn't just in the room, it was inside her, seeping into her veins, pooling in her chest, suffocating her with its intensity. She could feel the magic pulsing within her, urging her to unleash it, to let the fire consume everything around her. Her body was no longer just moving to the rhythm of the music, it was responding to something far greater, something primal that had been lying dormant inside her all this time. The flames at her feet roared to life as she danced, their light bright enough to cast long shadows across the hall. The heat was unbearable, but she couldn't stop. It wasn't the king's command she followed anymore, it was the fire, the magic that called to her, that urged her to dance beyond the limits she had once thought possible. With every leap, the flames grew higher, spreading out like a storm of fire and fury, chasing her movements as though they had a life of their own. The king's laughter echoed through the hall. His eyes gleamed with cruel delight as he watched her move, as if he were witnessing the culmination of his cruel manipulations. He wanted more. He wanted her to burn, to be consumed by the fire that had grown from her gift into something dangerous. But he didn't see the way her eyes glinted with defiance, the way her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was truly capable of. In that moment, a wave of anger washed over her, a deep, primal rage that had been festering inside her since the moment she had been brought to the king's court. The fire that surrounded her wasn't just a reflection of the king's cruelty, it was a reflection of her own inner strength, something that had been smothered for too long. The flames grew in response to her fury, swirling around her like a violent storm, their heat turning the air to steam. She could feel the magic pulsing as if it were finally waking from a long slumber, eager to be set free. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't dance for him, not like this. Her feet, once bound by the need to please the king, now became an instrument of her own will. With a swift movement, her body spun, and she sent a burst of flame toward the king's throne. The fire hit the floor, crackling as it spread, causing the courtiers to gasp in fear. The king's eyes widened in shock, but instead of backing away he grinned, fascinated, intoxicated by the very power he had tried to control. But for Ariadne, the moment marked a turning point. This wasn't just about a dance anymore. This was about freedom, her freedom from the king's oppression, from the chains of his tyranny. The fire was no longer just a performance for his amusement. It was a weapon she controlled. As the flames swirled around her, the king's obsession grew. He had pushed her too far, and now he saw the full extent of her power. The flames were no longer just dangerous, they were a manifestation of something deeper, something that connected her to the primal forces of nature. But rather than seeing it for the threat it was, the king viewed it as an opportunity. Now that she had the power, he thought he could harness it, use it to his advantage. He saw a spectacle waiting to be put on display for all of the kingdom, something that would awe his subjects and solidify his power. But in that moment Ariadne saw the truth. The king's control over her had never been about love or admiration. It had always been about subjugation, about owning her and using her as a tool for his own desires. He would never see her as anything other than an object, a weapon to wield. And that realization fueled the fire that burned brighter in her chest. As the fire began to settle, the murmurs in the court grew louder. The people, once passive onlookers to the king's cruelty, now saw her in a different light. Whispers of fear and awe spread through the room. Some of the courtiers, once loyal to the king, now saw Ariadne as something more than a mere dancer. They saw her as a savior, someone who had the power to free them from the tyranny of the king's reign. Others, however, feared what she had become. They whispered about the danger she posed, about how unstoppable she could be if she ever fully embraced the power within her. For Ariadne, the fire was no longer just a symbol of her captivity, it was a spark of rebellion. The flames that had once been a tool for the king's pleasure were now a symbol of her freedom, and she was ready to take control of her own fate. The path ahead was uncertain, and the king would not let her go easily, but she could feel the change within her, the stirring of something greater than herself. And she would never go back to being the object of his desires. This was only the beginning. The night of the grand performance was meant to be like any other, just another display for the king's pleasure, another moment where Ariadne would dance at his command. She had performed countless times before, each movement crafted to keep him entertained, to maintain her position in the palace. But tonight was different. Tonight the king wanted more. He had ordered a public performance, one that would show the people of the kingdom how powerful she had become, how her dance could summon flames that consumed the air itself. It was supposed to be a spectacle, a triumph. But as the torches were lit around her and the music began to play, Ariadne could feel it, the magic stirring within her, more intense than ever before. She had been dancing in the king's court for months now, each performance pushing her further into a corner. But the flames, her flames, had been growing with each movement until now they felt wild. The more she danced, the more she could feel them pulling at her, urging her to let go, to unleash them completely. But she had always managed to hold them back, to control the fire that threatened to consume her. The king, seated on his golden throne, was watching with a gleam in his eye, his hands clutched together in eager anticipation. He expected her to dance with the same grace and control as she always had, but this time, he had pushed her too far. She had become a tool, an instrument of entertainment, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before the fire would escape her control. As the music swelled, Ariadne's body responded. Her feet, once careful and measured, now moved with reckless abandon. The flames at her feet began to flicker, small sparks at first, But then they grew, swelling like a tide, licking the air and curling around her limbs. The heat intensified and the palace walls began to crack under the pressure. The courtiers watched in awe, unaware of the danger building in front of them. Then, in an instant, everything exploded. Her feet slammed onto the floor, and with a deafening roar, a wave of fire surged from her body, shooting upward in a brilliant column of light. The flames roared like a beast unleashed, swallowing the air, the walls, the very stone beneath her feet. The entire hall was engulfed in fire, the torches on the walls shattering in a shower of sparks as the inferno spread rapidly, too fast to contain. The king's shocked expression turned to one of terror as he watched his palace, his kingdom, consumed by the flames she had called forth. Ariadne froze in the center of the chaos, the magic pouring out of her uncontrollably, faster and faster, as if the very earth was cracking open beneath her. The fire swirled around her like a storm, wild and untamed. She had never felt anything like this before, a surge of power so intense so overwhelming, that it was as if the world itself was bending to her will. The heat scorched the air, warping everything in sight. The furniture around her caught fire, the tapestries on the walls turning to ash in an instant. The king's panic was palpable. His voice trembled as he shouted for the guards to contain the fire, but the flames ignored him. Ariadne wasn't just dancing anymore, she was unleashing something ancient, something that was beyond his control. For the first time, the king realized what he had created. Not a mere dancer but a force of nature, an uncontrollable power that could obliterate everything he had built. The people who had gathered in the hall began to panic, scrambling to escape the inferno that raged around them. Some tried to flee, but the flames seemed to follow them, chasing them, curling around their bodies as though they were being drawn into the magic. The royal guards tried to douse the flames with water, but it was futile. The fire laughed at their attempts, growing brighter with each failed attempt to quench it. Amidst the chaos, Ariadne stood frozen, her chest heaving, the realization dawning upon her like a storm cloud breaking overhead. She wasn't just a dancer anymore. She had become a force, a creator, a destroyer. Her dance, once a tool of performance, had become the embodiment of change. She could no longer deny it. This power had always been inside her, and now it was out in the open for the world to see. The fire, which had always been a quiet hum beneath her feet, was now a living thing hungry for more. But as the flames continued to rage, her mind shifted. The fire wasn't just destruction, it was creation. She could reshape the world around her. The palace, once a gilded cage, was crumbling, but within the flames Ariadne saw something else. The possibility of a new world, a world free from oppression, free from the king's cruel rule. The flames were not just a symbol of her anger, they were the catalyst for change, for the rebirth of everything she had been forced to endure. The kingdom's reaction was swift. Word spread quickly, carried by those who had managed to escape the palace. The people, once fearful and oppressed under the king's rule, began to see Ariadne not just as a victim, but as a symbol. Some cheered her name, seeing in her a revolutionary, a force that could tear down the old order and rebuild something new. To them, she was a savior, the one who had broken free of the king's tyranny and had shown them the way. Others, however, saw only destruction. The flames that had once been her gift had now become a curse, threatening to destroy everything the kingdom had built. They whispered of the end of the world, of a queen whose dance could burn everything to the ground. Fear spread like wildfire, and the king, once the ruler of all, now found himself in a desperate position. He had no way to stop her, no way to control the flames. Ariadne had become the threat he had always feared, unstoppable, uncontrollable. As the fire continued to spread, Ariadne stood at its heart, undeterred. She could feel the flames dancing around her, a reflection of the power that surged within her. She had finally realized what she was, no longer just a dancer, but a force that could shape the future of the kingdom. It was up to her now. Would she be the savior, the one who could tear down the old world and build something new, or would she become the destroyer, consumed by the fire that she had unleashed? The answer was still unclear, but one thing was certain. Ariadne's dance had changed everything. The decision had never been more clear or more agonizing. Standing on the precipice of everything she had ever known, Ariadne felt the weight of the kingdom's fate bearing down on her shoulders. The fire inside her burned hot, an unrelenting force that threatened to consume everything in its path. She had the power to reshape the world, to bring about a new order, but it came at a steep cost. The king, in his blind ambition, had underestimated the magic within her. Once, he had marveled at her fire, using it for his own pleasure, manipulating her for entertainment. But now, as the flames raged through the king saw her not as a mere performer, but as a threat to his power, something he could not control. His previous affection had turned to fear and desperation. His kingdom was on the verge of ruin, and his only hope lay in using Ariadne's magic to restore his reign, or to bend it to his will. He offered her a choice, though it wasn't one that could truly be called a choice at all. He promised her power, more power than she could imagine, but only if she bent her will to him. His words were sweet but laced with manipulation, reminding her of the comfort of the palace, the luxury she would lose if she defied him. He threatened those she had come to care for, her allies in the court, the few people who had shown her kindness in a world where kindness was a rare commodity. He promised them safety but only if she complied. He whispered of the chaos that would ensue, of the destruction that would follow if she did not use her powers to restore the order he had worked so hard to maintain. But Ariadne had come to realize something over the past few months. The king's order wasn't the order she sought. The kingdom he ruled was built on the suffering of others, on the backs of the very people she had come to see as her own. The fire within her, the magic that had once been a source of pain and confusion, now felt like the only way to purge the rot from the kingdom, to cleanse it of the oppression that had taken root in its heart. If she followed the king's orders, she would forever remain a tool, a weapon to be used at his whim. She knew that she had the power to change everything, but the question now was whether she would embrace her role as a destroyer or whether she could find a way to use her power differently, to save the kingdom from itself. Ariadne stood in the king's chambers, her heart pounding in her chest as his voice echoed through the air. The decision before her felt like a burning pit she was being asked to walk into. A choice between power and freedom, between destruction and rebirth. In that moment, Ariadne realized that she could never again be controlled by the king. Her magic was hers and no man, not even a king, could take that away. She wasn't just the tool of his desires or the object of his fantasies. She was something greater, something more dangerous, and more powerful. As the king continued to speak, promising safety and power, something snapped within her. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the fire that had long been at her feet now surging up through her veins. She took a deep breath and made her decision, not with her head but with her heart. She would not be a pawn in the king's game. She would no longer be at his mercy. The king's face twisted with anger as he saw the change in her. His eyes hardened and his hands clenched into fists. He had always believed that Ariadne would eventually bend to him, that she would obey him like all the others. But now, in the midst of her rebellion, he realized just how wrong he had been. Ariadne, with fire in her heart, turned away from him. Her decision was made. She wouldn't stand in his court any longer, wouldn't be his tool or his possession. Instead, she would reshape the kingdom with her own fire, burn away the old to make way for something new. With one swift motion, she threw open the palace doors, stepping out into the world that awaited her. The fire within her surged as she moved, and as her feet touched the ground, the earth trembled beneath her. The people who had once feared her, who had once whispered in terror of her name, now watched in awe as she stood before them. A woman unchained a woman with the power to change everything. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, their hopes and fears entwined. Some would see her as a savior, the one who could free them from the king's tyranny. Others would see her as a destroyer, a force too powerful to be contained. But Ariadne didn't care. She had made her choice. The fire that burned inside her wasn't just for destruction, it was for transformation. She didn't want to burn the kingdom down to the ground, but she couldn't ignore the truth that had become clear to her. The kingdom itself needed to be reborn. The old ways were broken and she had the power to create something new, something better, something just. She raised her arms, and the flames around her began to swirl, a massive column of fire that reached toward the sky. It wasn't an explosion of rage, it was a manifestation of will, of purpose. She was not destroying for destruction's sake, she was purging the kingdom of its rot, cleansing it of the corruption that had poisoned its heart. The fire, once a symbol of fear, now became a symbol of renewal. The people watched as the flames spread across the land, not in a chaotic inferno, but in a controlled wave of purification. The crops that had burned in the initial inferno now began to sprout anew, stronger and healthier. The cities, once plagued by greed and oppression, began to heal. The fires weren't just destroying, they were bringing forth life in their wake. As Ariadne walked through the kingdom, her magic working to heal the land, she felt the weight of her decision. She had chosen freedom not just for herself, but for everyone who had been bound by the chains of the king's rule. She had become something more, something that could never again be controlled. But with that freedom came a price. She was no longer the woman she had once been. She had walked away from the palace, from the life she had known. The fire had transformed her into something new, and she would have to learn to live with the consequences of her choice. The kingdom would be different now, changed, but not destroyed. And Ariadne, the woman who had once danced for the king's pleasure, now stood at the center of that transformation. Years had passed since the flames of rebellion had swept through the kingdom, leaving behind a landscape forever changed. The once proud walls of the palace had crumbled into rubble, but from that rubble new life had emerged. The streets were no longer littered with the remnants of the old world, but with the bustling of a free people rebuilding, reconnecting, and reimagining their lives. Ariadne's fire had not only destroyed, it had cleared the way for something better, something brighter. The kingdom that had once been ruled by fear and wealth was now a place of balance. No longer were the nobles and merchants the only ones with a voice. The common folk, the ones who had once bowed before their masters, now found themselves standing beside each other as equals. New leaders had emerged from among the people, chosen not for their titles, but for their wisdom, their compassion, and their ability to bring about change. Ariadne's legacy was not as a tyrant as some had feared, but as a visionary who had dared to rewrite the rules. Some spoke of her as a savior, the one who had broken the chains of oppression. Others, especially those who had lost their grip on power, whispered that she was a destructive force, a woman who had burned the kingdom to the ground in pursuit of her own ideals. But no matter the interpretation, Ariadne's name was spoken with reverence, for she had shown the people that the future could be reshaped by the will of those who dared to act. As for Ariadne herself, she had stepped away from the throne. The fire that had once defined her had become less about destruction and more about creation. She had found new ways to channel her power, not through performance or spectacle, but through the everyday struggles of rebuilding, of guiding the kingdom into a new era. She was no longer the dancer but the leader of a movement, a guide who understood the true nature of freedom, that it came with both great responsibility and great cost. Reflecting on her journey, Ariadne realized that the magic within her had never been just about the flames at her feet. It had been about the choices she had made. She had been faced with the choice to destroy or to rebuild, and she had chosen the latter, though the path had been fraught with pain. She had learned that true power lay not in the ability to burn everything down, but in the ability to control the fire, to use it to ignite hope rather than fear. She had reshaped her own destiny and, in doing so, had reshaped the world around her. And as she walked through the kingdom, now full of life and promise, she knew one thing for certain. The fire that had once threatened to consume her had now become her greatest strength, a flame that would continue to burn brightly, not in rage but in hope.